This series has been a complete mess with a tremendous amount of problems. The previous episodes were full of plot holes, inconsistencies, and general errors of canon. This episode is a little different, mind you, it's still garbage, but it doesn't have a lot of those particular issues. Instead, it suffers mostly from absurd pacing and the sheer laziness on behalf of the writers. This is because they wanted to tell a certain story, and for that story to be told, it would have taken far too long for the time allotted in a single episode. So the writers took incredible shortcuts with absurd explanations and jumping from one scene to the next at lightning speed. Also, it should be noted that the animation in this episode is extra lazy and dumb, which is kind of impressive considering a lot of the animation in this series is lazy and dumb. Truthfully, this isn't the worst episode in the series, but it definitely ranks up as one of the most boring. Marvel's What If is bad. Episode 6. The change that occurs in this universe is when Tony Stark's convoy got attacked, he's saved by Killmonger, therefore he never gets held in the cave, and he never creates the Iron Man suit. Also, I think I might have mentioned this once before, but having some of the characters being voiced by the original actors and some of them not sounds kind of weird. And it's particularly bad for Tony Stark because whoever they got to replace Robert Downey Jr. doesn't really do a very good job, and instead it just sounds a lot more high-pitched and nasally than it should. I know there are limited options when the original actor doesn't want to be involved in the project, but this one just stands out a little bit too much. Regardless, as we begin, the convoy gets attacked, and just like last time, most of the soldiers get taken out pretty quickly. Remember how I said that the animation in this episode was extra lazy and dumb? Well, here are a couple of examples of that. First thing is, in this episode, Tony is using a flip phone, which is not the same as the BlackBerry-looking thing that he had in the movie. And I know, this seems like it's a very small thing, but as I've mentioned many times before, the problem is not that this very small error exists, but rather the extremely high frequency at which these errors continue to happen. They just keep popping up again and again, and really, it probably would have taken the animators all of 30 seconds to go and double check to make sure that they had the right thing, but they just couldn't be bothered to do that. And that's kind of the point that I'm trying to emphasize, that Disney and the people making these shows and these movies, they just don't care, and they can't be bothered to even check on these things. But it gets even dumber a few seconds later with the next animation mistake showing Killmonger's weapon that for some bizarre reason doesn't have any sights or an aiming device of any kind.
You serious?
It's like the animators got 70% of it done and then just decided not to finish it out of sheer laziness. Again, with Disney, it's all about quantity over quality. And as dumb as all that is, there's an even worse one in the final episode of the season. Regardless, Killmonger is able to successfully rescue Tony Stark, and as a result, Tony never changes his behavior or his priorities. When Tony gets back home during a press conference, he tells everyone that he's not going to draw down on creating weapons, but rather that he's going to increase it, and he also names Killmonger as his new head of security. And here is where it starts to get really lazy. The Iron Man movie centered around Obadiah trying to take over the company and eventually being the villain at the end, but this episode wants to go a different way, and they needed to get rid of that, so the writers did it in the laziest and dumbest way possible, which I might point out seems to be the go-to solution for pretty much everything that happens in this series.
What a story!
It just so happens that Killmonger has a massive amount of documentation showing that Obadiah was responsible for the attack and that he had planned to do a bunch of other bad stuff. So he gets dragged away by security, and we never see him again.
Bye-bye then.
And believe me when I say this isn't even the laziest thing that they're going to do in the series, it's gonna get a lot worse in later episodes. Regardless, Tony Stark gives Killmonger another promotion and makes him COO in place of Obadiah. Pepper Potts has a conversation with not original Rhodey, where she displays a great deal of concern over Killmonger. Now, earlier I said that this episode didn't have as much of an issue with retcons, but it still has them, and this is one of them. You see, Marvel's What If series was made during MCU Phase 4, also known as the MCU, also known as the series where all of the shows and the movies lost money because no one cares about your woke bullshit. Anyways, that means that every female character needs to be vastly more intelligent than all of the other male characters in the room. Pepper Potts from the first Iron Man movie wasn't exactly stupid, but she certainly wasn't all that intelligent either. And of course, during the MCU, that is no longer allowed. So in this episode, she's depicted as being a super genius who is capable of figuring out all sorts of things that the dumb men are just not able to figure out because they're too dumb. This leads into a very MCU ending for the episode as well, but we'll get to that later. Back at Tony's house, Killmonger manages to trick him into creating robots that will fight, so young men and women won't have to go onto the battlefield. Killmonger has been working on this project for years, but was never able to solve the issue of AI, so Tony pulls up some of his old plans and makes a remark on how they look, to which Killmonger responds that they look that way because he likes anime. This was obviously done to give the robots a more distinct and different look from the original Iron Man suits, but I also can't help but laugh because right now in the real world, Marvel Comics are getting absolutely destroyed by Japanese anime and manga, to the point where a single issue of manga sells more in a month than every single Marvel comic combined. There's a montage of the two trying and failing to create the robots, but they keep running into energy problems until Killmonger suggests that they could use vibranium, and he happens to have a small amount of it in the form of a ring. They try it out and realize that they're going to need a lot more of it if they plan on making an entire army of robots, so Tony is going to buy a massive quantity of vibranium from a character named Ulysses Klaue. However, for some reason, when the transaction is going to happen, it's the not original Rhodey who acts as the person buying the vibranium, and he does so in what appears to be a semi-official capacity while working for the US military. But I have to ask, why? Why would they be doing this? If the US military was aware that there was this much vibranium that they could buy on the cheap from Ulysses Klaue, then why wouldn't they have just done it themselves? Why would they now be sending not original Rhodey to buy it on behalf of Tony Stark? Like, none of this makes any sense at all.
Somehow Palpatine returned.
And really, it just seems to me that the writers were intent on including more of not original Rhodey in this episode, so they decided to throw him in the situation, even though it really didn't make any sense. So before the transaction is able to take place, the ship is attacked by Black Panther. He manages to take out all of Klaue's men, but is eventually stopped when Killmonger uses some sort of sonic weapon. He removes one of the gloves from Black Panther and uses it to kill not original Rhodey, implicating Black Panther as his killer. He also places the sonic weapon in the hands of not original Rhodey to make it look like they had killed each other. We also get another display of really stupid animation where Killmonger uses the same glove with the claws on it to strike at a door, and somehow, even though he just kind of like claws at the door and like scratches it, for some reason the entire door just falls off the hinges, even though he didn't even hit the hinges. He just clawed the middle of it, and then it just falls off. I don't know how that would happen, but it did. Because, I don't know.
Just made it up on the spot.
Ulysses then gives us some exposition that he leaked the information about the transaction in order to set up this fake battle, and this is another great example of where the story needs to move forward, and the writers didn't have a good way of doing it, so instead they just drop some exposition in lieu of actual storytelling. Wakanda is outraged, and during a speech, the king of Wakanda gives us some woke garbage about how America is evil and imperialistic. This is the sort of garbage you would expect from a college professor who thinks he knows about world politics just because he took a vacation to the Bahamas that one time.
I think what I hate most about you is your textbook liberal agenda.
But don't worry, it gets worse. We get another example of more lazy writing. Killmonger heads back to Stark Tower and tells Tony that it's time for some payback for what Black Panther did to not original Rhodey. However, Tony doesn't believe a word of it and shows a holographic recording of all the events that occurred on the ship. So, we are expected to believe that Tony saw all of this happening with what I would have to assume a satellite, and yet he did absolutely nothing and just sat around and waited for Killmonger to come back to Stark Tower.
None of this makes sense.
Which brings up a couple of good questions. With the amount of time that Killmonger has been working with Tony Stark, wouldn't he expect that there would be satellites watching the ship during the transaction? It doesn't even have to be super advanced holographic stuff. Even some simple pictures would have been enough. And yet, for some reason, this scenario just never occurred to Killmonger. And for Tony, why would he sit and wait at Stark Tower? Why would he assume that Killmonger was going to go back there and not try to escape with all the vibranium and the money that was going to be used to buy it? In order for the sequence of events to happen, we're expected to believe that two extremely intelligent characters have suddenly become incredibly stupid for no logical reason.
You really believe that? How pathetic.
What's happening here is something that I've mentioned numerous times before, and it all boils down to this. The writers want a specific event to occur in the story, but in order for that to happen, they need to break the story or the characters, and in this case, they need to make the characters as brainless, well, as a Disney writer, which is an irony that I'm sure is lost on them.
Know your fucking place, trash.
Tony then reveals he has a working robot prototype and he uses it to attack Killmonger. However, Killmonger is able to use a spear made of vibranium and he destroys the robot and then he kills Tony. Once more, I need to point out the laziness in both the animation and the storytelling because the spear only hits Tony in the shoulder and he stands there pinned as the spear has gone through him and is now stuck in the wall behind him. This sort of injury certainly could be fatal if Tony was allowed to bleed out, but it would take a decent amount of time, and the writers wanted to have a little more dialogue between these two before Killmonger finishes off Tony by pushing the spear further into the wall.
I'll bleed you real quiet. Leave you here.
Because let me remind you that the spear had already gone all the way through him and was in the wall, so pushing the spear into the wall a little bit more is not actually going to cause any additional harm, and yet the show decides that this is the thing that's going to cause Tony to die. No, it doesn't make any sense at all. It's absurd, and this scene was made in this way to add a dramatic effect, but it just doesn't work, because instead it shows the sheer laziness and incompetence of both the animation and the writing.
You're a little flawed and you're not too bright, but you're one of a kind.
Tony's death is blamed on Wakanda, which allows General Thunderbolt Ross to take control of the robot program, and he then puts all of the robots into mass production to be used in a war against Wakanda. And soon, there is an entire army of these robots being led by Killmonger. He meets up with Ulysses Klaue, who knows the location of Wakanda, but Killmonger double-crosses Ulysses and kills him. He then carries his body into Wakanda as a gift, and the king welcomes him back with open arms. Killmonger informs them about the incoming robot attack, and the plan that they come up with is to deliberately allow the robots inside the shield so that the satellite communication gets cut off. In other words, these writers use the exact same strategy that was done during the Infinity War movie because they aren't smart enough to come up with something new on their own. The robots walk into the Shield Dome and, as predicted, they all shut down, but then Killmonger uses what basically looks like a Stark Industries garage door opener with a big red button to secretly reactivate all the robots. This forces Wakanda to engage with the robots, and it leads to more incredibly stupid animation like this. In the MCU, vibranium is one of the strongest metals and can even be used to cut through most things. However, even using vibranium, a person still needs enough strength to actually slice through something, and the stronger it is, the more strength you would need. Black Panther could use his claws to cut through a lot of stuff because he had superhuman strength. However, a normal person would not be able to push one of these spears through a robot, let alone this 60-year-old woman. Even having said that, it would be one thing if they were just stabbing the spearhead into the robots, but it gets even dumber because not only are they trying to show that a woman old enough to have a senior citizen discount at Walgreens is able to effortlessly slice through these giant metal robots, somehow she also manages to do it with the blunt shaft of the spear.
I expect nothing, and I'm still let down.
And this idiocy doesn't happen just once, but numerous times where they show that the blunt part of the spear is able to cut through the robot somehow.
It is a tale told by an idiot.
Regardless, Killmonger decides to join the fight in order to prove his worth and gain prestige, and this of course was his plan all along, as now he is going to be chosen as the next Black Panther. When he takes in the heart-shaped herb and travels to the Nightland, he doesn't meet with his father, but instead it's T'Challa who cautions him against the path that he's going. And as the episode comes to a close, we get more of the MCU, and this time it's Pepper Potts as she heads into her office where she meets with T'Challa's sister. What's her name? Who cares? Anyways, They talk about how both of their countries are about to go to war and that the men in power are not going to listen, so it's up to the strong woman to open their eyes and guide them in the right way, because fucking of course. This episode certainly has its problems, but as I said, it's far from being the worst in the series. However, keep in mind that this episode was based off of the first Iron Man movie, the movie that launched the entire MCU, and even today is one of the best within it. And really, it's a shame to see just how far that quality has fallen. Sadly, as we're about to find out, the quality can sink even further. But thankfully, that's the end of episode 6.